First, I would like to congratulate you for being selected to this program. This is very competitive. We had over 400 expressions of interest, and you are among 104 have been selected. So you did very good job showing very strong interest and commitment to the cause. That's why you are selected. And we also see a strong potential and capability of applying your knowledge to your real life situations through this course. So thank you. With no further ado, I would like to introduce our special guest today before starting the lecture. Today, we are honored to have Professor Frank Yotso, Director of the Grand Challenge Program on Zero Carbon Energy for Asia Pacific here at the ANU, and also head of the Energy Institute of Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. We are honored to have Ms. Sherpa Yevenpa, Director of the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, or ETP, and also our partner, including Ms. Tarek from MPES and other local partners from Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And very fortunately, today we have the presence of His Excellencies, Mr. Dr. Tak Ding Thi, the Vice Chair of Science, Technology and Environment of Vietnam National Assembly. And that's equivalent to Deputy Minister level in Vietnamese government, for those who are not familiar with Vietnamese government. So thank you very much, all our special guests today. And now I would like to invite Professor Frank Yotso to deliver welcome remarks. So over to you, Professor Frank.
Yes, welcome. Welcome to the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, and in particular, the roundtables of the partnership. So what is this? It's a 2-year capacity building and also networking program in Indonesia, the Philippines, and in Vietnam, in a regional partnership delivered in substantive measure from here in Australia. So what we're kicking off today is a 20-week structured online training program comprising a number of professional forums and training sessions related to our region's energy transition. As my colleague Dr. Tang Do mentioned, we have around 100 participants enrolled. This is the group here today. You come from government agencies, from industry, from civil society in Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and you have, of course, been selected from over 400 who have expressed an interest to take part. And the goal here is for us to help provide you with the latest understanding and also analytical tools to accelerate the energy transition to low emission systems, reliable energy supply systems, both in policy and in markets, and also, of course, in the process to help build professional networks within your countries and across boundaries. So yes, my name is Frank Yotso. I'm a professor here at the Australian National University, at the university's Public Policy School, and also I'm the head of energy at the university's Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. This partnership and the roundtable component of the partnership is delivered by a consortium comprising the ANU and the Australian Mekong Partnership for Environmental Resources and Energy Systems, or AMPERS for short. Today we start the executive training component of this program with a session on Australia's experience with the energy transition in the global context. And as you will hear from my colleague, Professor Ken Baldwin, there are some very big changes underway in Australia's energy system, Australia's industrial system as well. And there are very important inferences that we can draw for many other countries as well. And over the coming weeks and months, you will be able to hear from and in fact discuss with a number of expert researchers who work at the cutting edge of energy research here at the Australian National University. We certainly look forward very much to the opportunity to engage with you and We hope for very lively exchange in this group. So please do take the opportunity to ask questions, share your experience and perspectives, both by way of speaking in the group, and also please do use the chat that is available here on the Zoom function. I'll close with a thank you, of course, to our project partners, including Ms. Sirpa Javanpar, who you will hear from in just a minute. She's the director of the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership. And also, of course, a very warm thank you to our partners at Ampères, and importantly, the partner organizations in each of the 3 partner countries. First, though, and very importantly, I have the pleasure to invite Mr. Ta Dinh Thi to take the floor. He is a member of Vietnam's National Assembly, and as you've heard, the vice chair of the Science, Technology and Environment Committee. Mr. Thi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Phanh Jojo. Dear Professor Phanh Jojo, Professor Ken Ban Uyên, Dr. Đỗ Nam Thắng from Australian National University, Mr. Sirpa Javanpar, Director of Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, colleagues and the course participants from Indonesia, the Philippines and Vietnam, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership Executive Training course. Energy transition towards a low and zero carbon society has started in many parts of the world, including our region and our countries. It is an essential process to help us address many common issues such as climate change, energy shortage, and local pollution. Importantly, the transition towards clean and affordable energy system will enable us to achieve sustainable development goals. The post-pandemic recovery period is a great opportunity to accelerate this process. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that this training course will provide you with rich information and knowledge about the energy transition. The course program looks very impressive to me. It is a comprehensive with update today's energy important topics. The Australian National University has a world-class expertise in energy and in the Asia-Pacific region. It has a great number of dedicated and capable staff with strong track record in the delivery of knowledge and technology on renewable energy and the energy transition. I have met many ANU alumni who are capable of applying the acquired knowledge and skill to address streamline issues. I believe that you will be among them soon. I hope that through this course, you will also have to be able to expand and strengthen your network in energy and climate change. Getting to know the renowned experts from the ANU and learning from them and from other peer course participants are great opportunity for you to further your professional network. I also see this course as a good opportunity to strengthen our regional efforts, in particular in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, in energy transition and addressing climate change. Our country, Vietnam, is going forward to implement our goal towards zero net carbon emission by 2050. I would like to thank ANU for this opportunity to see you today. I wish you all the best and support every success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tadinti, for a very warm welcome and speeches. Thank you very much again. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Sopa Yapenpa, Director of Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, to deliver her remarks. So over to you, Sopa.
Good morning and thank you. Thank you, Tando, and good morning to all of you. I'd like to particularly thank the Australian University and all of you for coming into today's Energy Transition Roundtable session on renewable energy and the case of Australia. I'm particularly delighted to participate in the deep dive on the Australian experience, and I'm thankful for the words of His Excellency Mr. Tan Dinh Thi, Member of the Parliament and Vice Chairman of the Science, Technology and Environmental Committee of the Vietnam National Assembly, and particularly for his remarks on how the region has been always able to learn from the Australian experience and now today regarding climate and energy progress in terms of the energy transition. As many of you know, the Southeast Asian Energy Transition Partnership is a multi-donor partnership with governments of Germany, France, UK, and Canada, and private sector philanthropies, such as Children's Investment Fund Foundation, IKEA Foundation, Sequoia Climate Fund, and many others. This partnership has been established to support and strengthen the region's countries in their resolve to champion, implement, and coordinate energy transition in alignment with those national targets that Mr. Tan Dinh Thi mentioned earlier. So alignment with these targets will require also our attention to achieve a stronger and sustainable transition that is also equitable and fair to all the stakeholders. As ETP is a partnership itself, first and foremost, we also seek partnerships in all of our work, and we are also aware that energy transition requires alliances and all of our efforts, including yours, dear participants. In funding this Energy Transition Roundtable, ETP is implementing it in partnership with the CASE, which is the Clean, Affordable, Secure Energy Technical Assistance Program of the German government, and the Australian National University and peers. This enables us to deep dive into energy transition issues in Southeast Asia. And gaining exposure to the global practices, concepts, and tools for accelerating energy transition is critical for capturing the opportunities, but also for mitigating the possible mistakes that can or may occur in this journey. In the region, we have seen enhanced ambitions harnessed in the net zero carbon emission targets. The region's countries have also joined the Glasgow Pact, which points to the importance of the coal phase down in energy transition processes. This is obviously a significant undertaking, as energy transition is the biggest change project since industrialization. It will change the way our economies work and also bring significant benefits in terms of jobs, economic diversification, and the environmental benefits that will lead to new opportunities. The hard part is ahead of us, though, to develop and implement a clear plan to achieve that net zero emission target envisioned in the declarations. We have a lot of work to do, and knowledge underlines our collective capacity to accelerate energy transition, to align policies with these climate commitments, to de-risk the investment environment for viable, bankable energy efficiency and renewable energy investments, and to enhance flexibility of the electricity grid networks and expand smart grids, and underpin the progress with growing knowledge and growing awareness of the energy transition and its benefits. Today, we have an opportunity to learn the lessons from the world's most rapid expansion in deployment of renewable energy in the energy supply. Australia is on its way to realize the benefits of energy transition. So let me now warmly welcome all of you to take full advantage of this wonderful learning journey through the Energy Transition Roundtables, and pass the floor back to Dr. Tan Do and Professor Ken Baldwin for our session today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sopa. Very encouraging messages to all of us, especially to the course participants. So thank you very much. And now let me start sharing my screen and introduce you to the course. So again, I am Thando. I am the course convener of this very exciting program. Give me 1 minute. The computer usually takes me some seconds to start warming up and move to the next slide. Here we go. So, as you have access to the course Moodle site, and I assume that you have a look at the course outline. This is the agenda of our whole course over the next 24 weeks. The course will have 10 sessions. So today is the first session in which we're going to learn about the Australian transition, experience in the transition, and also global context, given by Professor Ken Bowen after the introduction session. And next week, we're going to learn from the renewable energy generation from Professor Andrew Blakers. After that, every 2 weeks, we will have the lecture at the same time. And the lectures will covering the topics of carbon pricing, international renewable energy systems, energy storage, and operation electricity grids. The topics also cover more policy-oriented topics such as the energy efficiency, trade, investment, green industrial policy, industrial workforce planning and transition, and social transition. So the program will cover not only the technical part of the energy transition, but also the social, economic, and policy aspects. One note here is that this session will be followed by the next session next week. And after that, we will have every 2 weeks. And from April, the time zone will be changing. So I highlight in orange color here. From those, so from section 4, International Renewable Energy System in April, the timing will be changed. And I will talk more about that in the next slide. The last course will be on the 29th of June, in which we will recap all the contents and close the training. After that, in the first 2 weeks of July, you will have opportunity to reflect what you have learned from the course through a short essay or report, in which you will address 2 questions. What are the most interesting components you have learned from the course? And what is your plan to apply the acquired knowledge during the course to your work? Then we will provide feedback on your essays and reports and issue the certificate of participations. So one important note here is that from April, the time zone will change. So the session times will be from 10 to 12 if you are in Bangkok, Jakarta, or Hanoi, and from 11 to 1 p.m. if you are in Manila. And some of you may be in different time zones, so you will need to check your time zone accordingly for your according session time. So please be careful and plan accordingly. During the course, we would encourage you to study the learning materials before the lectures. We will upload the pre-reading on the course Moodle site and available in English as well as in Bahasa and Vietnamese. We encourage you to attend the lectures regularly because all the lectures will contain important and interesting information. Participate in the lecture activities, including asking questions to the chat box and also sharing the information, sharing your experience. And particularly the course have the forum on the website in which you can put your questions or share your experience. And our course facilitators will make sure that all the questions will be addressed and also lead to wider discussions. And from that, we also build the network. We encourage you to interact with the lecturers and other course participants, and especially think about how to apply what you're learning to your work. So if you could do these activities regularly and actively, I'm sure that you will make most out of the course. After the course, we will issue the certificate of participants to those who completed at least 80% attendance. We will check your attendance regularly to see your, and we would love to see your active 100% if possible attendance. Another condition is, as I mentioned earlier, your final essay or report of 800 to 1,000 words, reflecting about the course and your learning. We also do the course evaluation at the end of the course, and also interviews with some of you. So we will have a kind of information library for those who have not had opportunities like you to attend the course, and make them as valuable as possible. And the next step, important one, is please stay tuned for the coming policy deep dives and other activities of the course. After this executive training course, we plan to have a series of other deep dive policy dialogues, and we will welcome you to attend. And also, one of the key selection criteria we will consider is your active participation during the course. So please stay active during the course, and that might lead to other opportunities. For example, attending the future activities by the ETP as well as ANU, MPS, and our partners. And possibly we will be able to invite you to have a field visit in Australia, visiting ANU campus sometime in the future, either in this program or in other programs that we are developing. So that's a future plan. And staying active, engaged in the course would be key determinant for your continuing participating in our future activities. Now I'd like to pause here and see whether you have any quick feedbacks. And I'd like to check whether Professor Ken Bowen is here. Not yet. Ken, whether you are here, please.
Hi, Tung. Yes, I'm here, ready to go.
Oh, great. Thanks. Thanks, Ken. Now, this is the last slide of my presentation. If you have any questions, the first contacts will be Ms. Tien Lê if you are from Vietnam, Mr. Iben if you are from the Philippines, and Ms. Nisa if you are from Indonesia. So please contact the team here if you have any questions. They will be the first focal points to address your questions and any issue, any concerns you may have. And we have, of course, a team to support you and support the cause. So I think that that's for now, and I'm sure that you may have questions, but we can hold that until later. We have more opportunities, and now I would like to invite Professor Ken to deliver the first session, very interesting session. So Professor Ken, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tung, and it's a pleasure to meet you all this afternoon. It is, as Tung indicates, the starting presentation in the series, and it's important, I think, as we enter the energy transition in our respective countries, to understand the lessons from the rest of the world in the global context, and particularly to also see what is happening in Australia, where we are experiencing the very rapid conversion of our energy systems to renewable energy as we speak. So that's why this session is called the Australian Experience in the Global Context. So I'd like to take you through that. Just to let you know, we will be pausing every now and then for questions. So if you have a question, then please use either the chat or the raise hand indicator in your bottom control panel, and we can do some question and answer regularly throughout the afternoon. So as I mentioned, we are all experiencing now a global transition in energy systems. And this is motivated in large part by climate change, knowing, of course, that in order to keep the temperature rise of the globe to below 1.5 or even 2 degrees, we have to fully decarbonise our world economy by the middle of this century. And so this, of course, is driving a large degree of the energy change that we are seeing in the world. But there are also other good reasons why we might want to change our energy systems. And these relate to energy and security, to ensure that we always have a dependable supply of energy, to energy access, because there are over 1 billion people in the world who do not, for example, have access to electricity. So we might need to change our energy systems, for example, towards renewable microgrids to enable them to access energy. And then finally, energy underpins all aspects of the global economy. And having advanced and more reliable and cheaper forms of energy enables us to improve the productivity of our economies. So for all these reasons, we are motivated to look at changing our energy systems, but particularly because of climate change. And let me give you the bottom line at the very beginning of this presentation. So the take-home message is that there will be a massive transformation take place in the world's energy supply in the coming decades. And this will affect absolutely everything, and in particular, our energy and our energy security. So let's go back into history and just look at where the energy transition we're experiencing now sits in the scheme of things. And we go back to the Industrial Revolution in this graph, which you can see shows the amount of energy that the world has used in successive years since the Industrial Revolution and where that comes from. So you can see that back in around 1850, at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, it was mainly biomass that provided the energy source for the world. And of course, it has continued to do so. And interestingly, more or less at the same level, even though the world economy and population has grown enormously since that time. And of course, the Industrial Revolution was founded on the introduction of coal. This is the black part of the graph. And later, when we invented the internal combustion engine, on the energy sources from oil, and then, of course, from natural gas. We, in parallel, harnessed our river systems to generate hydropower. That's the light blue here. And more recently, since the 1960s, we have harnessed the power of nuclear fission. That's conventional nuclear power, the yellow line that we can see in the graph here. So all these contribute to the energy mix at present. And those of you who have very good eyesight can see that on the top of this graph lies a very, very thin purple line. And this is the sum total of all other renewable energy that exists up until the present. And it is a very small contributor. However, I will state at the beginning that other renewables, that is mainly solar and wind, will soon replace all carbon-based energy systems. And indeed, they need to do so in the next decade or two in order for us to reach our global climate change targets. So this will be a massive transformation. Everything you can see on this graph that uses carbon-based forms of energy will soon be transformed to renewables. So this will be a change that is comparable in scope and magnitude to the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of this graph. So let's now compare us in terms of the energy transition that we're undergoing at the moment to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was by and large driven by technology. It was by and large unplanned and unforeseen. These developments happened without people really having any previous knowledge of the new changes. As a result, there was huge social and economic dislocation, and governments played very little role in this, and the end result was largely chaotic. Let's contrast this then with what we might expect for the energy transition. It's similar in scope and magnitude to the Industrial Revolution, but it's driven mainly by climate change. Of course, it's facilitated by possibly even fortuitous advances in technology, which happen to have occurred at exactly the right time in history to allow us to mitigate the effects of our changing climate. And in this sense, it's completely foreseeable and it can be planned because we do understand what needs to be done, and we do avoid social and economic dislocation in the energy transition. And for this reason, government has a key role in the planning process to make this happen in a smooth, efficient, and economically effective way. So the energy transition doesn't have to resemble the Industrial Revolution. We know that it's coming, and we have the ability and the tools to deal with it. Indeed, the energy transition is happening as we speak. This graph shows the new energy capacity additions in gigawatts per year for a range of different energy generation technologies. And we can see that solar PV, photovoltaics, and wind are already the dominant forms of new energy generation additions in the global energy system. Gas is more or less constant. Coal seems to be declining. Hydro is constant, if not declining. Nuclear has bubbled along at the bottom a bit, along with bio and a few other smaller forms of generation. But it is really this ramping up of solar and wind that is changing the energy systems as we speak, and it's the either the constant or the declining role for fossil fuels that will be a feature for the energy transition in years to come. In this global context, Australia has an important role to play, and the reason for that is shown in this graph, where we see the amount of installed renewable energy capacity per person in each year by different regions of the world. And what we see here is that per capita, Australia is now leading the world in the installation of renewable energy capacity. So the current installation rate in Australia exceeds 250 watts of renewable energy capacity per person per year. This is 10 times the world average, and it's much greater than many other countries, which are shown here in this graph. So Australia, in some sense then, because of this change in the rate per person, is really at the leading edge of the energy transition. We are installing more renewable energy per person than any other country. And so we are learning very early on the lessons of the energy transition. So it's worth understanding what's happening in Australia so that other countries can benefit from this learning process. The other thing that's important to understand is that the energy growth will shift to the Asia-Pacific region. Here we have a graph from the International Energy Agency predicting where the primary energy demand centres will be in 2035. And we can see that the Asia-Pacific region will dominate the energy demand in the world. In fact, if you look at the growth in energy demand, as shown in this pie chart, you'll see that the non-OECD part of the Asia Pacific will contribute around 2/3 of the growth in energy demand in the period leading up to 2035. So this is very important because it means that this part of the world will be crucial to the energy transition and indeed to achieving the world's climate goals. And Australia is indeed part of the region and provides a lot of energy currently into the Asia Pacific. So at ANU, we have embarked on what we call a grand challenge, and it's titled Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific. And what we're trying to do here is to understand the key research drivers for transitioning the energy use of the Asia Pacific region towards renewable energy into the future. And the starting point for this is to understand the present, and in particular Australia's role in this process. So here I've got a diagram which shows the major export commodities for Australia, which are in energy and in minerals. There's another major export commodity, which is education. We educate a lot of international students in this country, and its value is typically in the top 3 or 4 export earners in Australia each year. But what I show here are the important ones for energy. So we have, for example, thermal coal, which is exported to mainly the Asia Pacific region, and it contributes to emissions in the region as well, of course. More than 500 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent each year, in fact. We also export liquid natural gas, LNG, which contributes more than 200 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent each year by use in energy and industrial processes in the Asia Pacific. So those are the energy exports that contribute to Asia Pacific's emissions from Australia. We also export a lot of minerals, in particular iron ore and aluminium ore, and these contribute more than 1,000 million tonnes of CO2 when they're converted, often using metallurgical coal from Australia, into iron and steel, and similarly more than 200 million tonnes of CO2 when aluminium ores are converted into aluminium. As a result, 96% of these emissions occur from Australian exports in the Asia Pacific region, and indeed contribute to 8.6% of the Asia Pacific's total greenhouse gas emissions. So these are very important consequential emissions arising from Australia's exports to the region. And in fact, if we total all these up, this amounts to nearly 2,000 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year in the Asia Pacific, which is 3.7 times Australia's own emissions. So we are a major contributor from Australia, if you like, to emissions in the Asia Pacific. Now, we all know that in order to reach our global climate targets by 2050, that we need to change this. And so our grand challenge is looking at how this might happen and ways in which renewable energy can play a role in a new trading relationship between Australia and the Asia Pacific. And we've published this very recently. It is about to appear in the journal Energy. So a future Australian export scenario might look something like this. Here we make 2 assumptions. The first assumption is that Australia exports the same amount of energy as it does now in joules. And we, in this scenario, assume that 80% of this energy is exported as hydrogen, which is shown by the big green arrow here, and 20% as renewable electricity, the smaller green arrow here, using high voltage direct current undersea cables to link Australia with Southeast Asia and potentially beyond. So in other words, all we're saying is that we're exporting the same amount of energy as we do now in thermal coal and liquid natural gas, except in the future, this will be done 80% as hydrogen and 20% as renewable electricity. The second assumption that we make is that Australia will mine the same amount of mineral ores, but export this as manufactured processed metals. 510 million tonnes as green steel using renewable electricity and hydrogen, and 18 million tonnes as green aluminium using renewable electricity to undertake this process. And so what you see then over here are the future export scenarios where we simply export the same amount of energy from Australia as we do now and use the same amount of minerals as we do now, but export that as green metals. If we add up the total amount of renewable energy required to do this, what we find is that this amounts to 7,000 terawatt hours per year. This is a really big number. To put it into context, this is 27 times Australia's current electricity generation. And indeed, if you remember that Australia has to, first of all, turn its own domestic renewable energy into 100% electricity from renewable energy by the middle of the century anyway, plus it has to electrify the rest of its economy. That's another 200% renewable energy. If you add this to the 27 times for export, then you end up with a number which is effectively 3,000% renewables. Or in other words, we have to build an electricity system 30 times as big as it is now and run it all from renewable energy. Now, of course, these are really big numbers, and indeed it would take the land area shown in this blue square in order to do this with 50% solar and 50% wind. This, by the way, is roughly 2% of Australia's land area, or a bit more of the land area used, for example, to harvest forests for timber. So let's say only 10% of this is true. This still means that we have to double Australia's zero emissions electricity future domestically, which is, as we say, requiring 300% renewables. That would have to become 600% if only 10% of the exports that we talk about here of renewable energy and green metals are actually realised. So this is a huge shift and indeed one that we undertake research on across a whole range of topics in order to understand what is needed to achieve this. And again, it's only to satisfy current energy demands and current demands for mineral ores. Okay, so now we might have a question break. If you would like to ask a question, then please use the raise hand facility. And then when you've finished, use lower hand to remove it. And I'll look for questions now and stop sharing for a moment. So while we're waiting people to put up their hands, I've got a question in the chat, which says, your graph of CO2 exports for iron ore, aluminium, etc., is very intriguing and very high numbers. Absolutely they are, because in order to process the mineral ores requires an enormous amount of energy. And currently this is being provided by fossil fuels, either through the metallurgical coal in blast furnaces for iron ore and steel, or through fossil fuel generation of electricity for aluminium smelting. So these are big numbers, but they are the true numbers. And so it is important to reduce these numbers in order to reach our global emissions objectives by the middle of the century. I see we have a question from Cristianto.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bartlett. Okay, my name is Cristianto, and thank you for this great opportunity from ANU. Currently, I work for the Ministry of Trade of Indonesia, so this issue is quite the hot topics right now in terms of trade negotiations with our trading partners.
Yes.
When I see your chart there, I would like first to congratulate Australia for the big achievement to be the leaders of renewable energy in the world. But there's some questions there. If you, for example, for industrial usages, how can we provide a stable energy, a renewable energy for energy intensified industries such as steels and iron forgery and something like that. Because here in Indonesia, if we want to switch and transition from like say a coal-based furnace technology into the renewable energy sources, that will be a great investment, a big investment for our current industry, and that will be, I don't know, economically challenge for our current industry right now. The second is when you say that your main three energy resources right now is from solar and wind, and you already said that it will take a big land transitions. Perhaps you will consume more and transition from like, I don't know, a big land that was used for agriculture, and then you switch it to like wind farm or solar farm like that. But then how you address the social problem? Because in Indonesia, agriculture is still our main and sensitive issues for our government. So if you transit that will be a big problem. So
I agree with you, and indeed we've got a special session later in the course. Okay.
I mean that's just my 2 cents.
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right. So we'll talk about that in one of the later sessions. But just briefly, in Australia, we have the benefit of the fact, well, I don't know if you think of it as a benefit, but most of our country is desert. It's land that's not used for agricultural production. And so there is great opportunity for siting solar and wind farms in these relatively underpopulated areas. Bearing in mind, though, that often these areas are owned by the Indigenous peoples of Australia. And so we have part of our project which looks at the Indigenous engagement opportunities for these communities to be co-investors, if you like, in these massive new renewable energy farms. So that's one thing that we're thinking of. But you're absolutely right. In countries where land is very highly utilised, these opportunities aren't so great. But Australia is in a good position to be an exporter of energy for exactly that reason. Going back to your first question about converting current iron and steel production facilities into facilities that use renewable energy. This is a huge transition process involving billions and billions of dollars of new investment in facilities that use renewable electricity to generate heat and that use hydrogen to reduce the iron ore, the iron oxide. So you've got to remove the oxygen from the iron. Currently, carbon is used to do that, to create carbon dioxide, which is, of course, bad. It's emitted. But the processes that are now being studied that use hydrogen, of course, create water with the oxygen, and this is then an inert byproduct of the process. So these processes are being studied at the moment. They are being scaled up using pilot plants to full industrial facilities, and eventually we believe that these will replace all current blast furnace facilities for creating iron and steel. But this will be a huge investment, as you point out, a massive change for the industry. It won't happen right away. In fact, it will probably happen in the latter part of the period leading into the middle of the century when we decarbonise the rest of the economy. These might be the processes that get decarbonised last of all, potentially. So very good question, thank you. Let me just have a quick look at the chat to see if I can answer one more quick question, because we do need to move on. So I just explained green steel and aluminium. I can refer you, so Mike Fidio asked about the equivalent units for ore export and energy. That's in our paper, so that's coming out in the Energy Journal shortly, so the answer is there. And then looking at coal pricing, so what I'm talking about here is not saying that these renewable energy opportunities are needed to replace coal. They can be just laid straight over the top of what's happening now. You don't need to retire coal first and then build the renewable energy opportunities. You can start building the renewable energy opportunities right now and take the benefit of doing that, because as we all know, it's actually cheaper at the moment to build solar and wind than it is coal-fired power stations. So let's not think about this as replacing one thing with another. Let's just think about it as building right over the top of what exists at the moment and starting this transition process immediately. And demand, the fall in demand will dictate then what happens to current coal production. All right, so let's move on, and I'll reshare my screen. So let's now go to the next part of the presentation, which is looking at technology. Okay, so this is all about how will this transition happen from a technology standpoint. And bear in mind, there are two elements to the transition. There's technology and there's policy, and I'll talk about policy after technology. Okay, so we have currently generating sources from fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. And obviously we need to replace them eventually. And the question is, what do we replace them with? So the choices are, first of all, nuclear power for those countries that allow it. And just remember that Australia does not allow nuclear power. In fact, nuclear energy is forbidden by law in Australia, one of the few countries in the world to do this. But other countries have embraced nuclear power, and indeed countries like France get the majority of their electricity from nuclear power. So nuclear power comes in two forms. There's nuclear fission, which is the breaking up of uranium nuclei, the fissioning of nuclei to release energy. That's a conventional nuclear power station. And then there's nuclear fusion, which is the joining together of lightweight nuclei of hydrogen isotopes. And this is the energy that powers the sun. Now, at the moment, there is no fusion power on Earth, but there is a massive investment from all the major economies in a fusion power reactor in France, which will harness the power inside the sun in a controlled environment here on Earth. And this has the big advantage that the fuel needed, which is isotopes of hydrogen, are readily available in the ocean, and there are no byproducts from nuclear waste. So that's some way off. It probably won't happen until the first demonstration, maybe in the 2030s, and it'll be middle of the century by the time the first commercial reactor might be developed anyway. So this is well beyond the time frame we need to address climate change. Okay, so the other forms of energy we can classify as global. So there's tidal energy from the movement of the Earth's tides caused by the gravitational attraction of the moon and the sun. So this is basically, if you like, another form of pumped hydro, where energy is stored in potential energy by water moving up, and then you allow the water to move downhill as the tide goes out, and this you can convert to electricity in the same way you can with hydropower. That's very expensive, and it by and large isn't commercial. And the same can also be said by and large of geothermal energy, another form of global energy, which accesses the heat that is generated within the Earth's crust. So this is in two forms. It's either steam at the surface, and indeed in Indonesia, geothermal energy is harnessed in this way by tapping into the steam at the surface and generating electricity. But the other form of geothermal is to drill down, if you don't have steam at the surface, and go deep down many kilometers into the rock and harness the heat in the rock, generate steam, and then make electricity that way. Unless you actually have the steam occurring at geothermal reservoirs at the surface, the drilling down process is very expensive. And really, it's the only option for most countries apart from, let's say, Indonesia and New Zealand, countries like that. So it's not very commercial if you need to drill into the rocks. And so really not available to many countries apart from those ones. And then finally, there's solar, and there's two forms, direct solar and indirect solar. Direct solar is all the solar we know about. It's solar heat. So this is, for example, heating water on your roof from the thermal energy from the sun. There's solar photovoltaics, which is PV, which is solar cells effectively. Which is the solar panels on our roofs or on solar farms, which generates electricity directly from sunlight. Then there's thermal electric, which again concentrates the sun's heat to create, for example, steam to drive a turbine. And then there's thermochemical, which is very similar, concentrating the sun's heat and then storing it in chemical forms, like ammonia, for example. So those are all direct solar. Then there's indirect solar. And what do I mean by this? Well, the sun drives a lot of processes. In fact, convection causes wind, and we then harvest the wind using wind turbines. So that's driven by the sun. We then have hydropower, which is essentially brought about by the evaporation of water by the sun, the condensing into clouds, the falling as rain into a river catchment, and then the harnessing of the power of the river by hydroelectricity after storing it in a dam. Then there's wave power, which of course is driven by the wind, which is also driven by the sun. And then finally, there's biomass. So this is plants that capture the sunlight using photosynthesis, and we then harness the stored energy in the plants. So essentially, these are all the forms of energy available to us. And I contend that in the future, the main forms of energy, and this is becoming apparent already, will be nuclear fission for those countries that allow it, and for the rest of the world, there will be opportunities with photovoltaics, with wind power, and with existing hydro, because in many countries it's very difficult to dam any more rivers, and so consequently there is limited opportunity for adding hydro capacity around the world. So the main forms of energy in a decarbonised world will be nuclear fission, photovoltaics, wind and hydro, mainly existing hydro, and with very little opportunity for fusion power to come in before we need to address climate change. So that's really a quick summary of where things are heading at the moment. How does this all work out? How do these technologies take over from fossil fuel, and which one wins the race? So now I'm going to talk about how this happens, and to understand that you have to understand what is called the learning rate, which is the change in the cost of a particular item, which could be a solar panel or a wind turbine or a coal-fired power station or a car or a television set. It's the change in the cost of that item as the number of units of that item increases in the production process. So in other words, it's a process of learning through research, through innovation, improvements in the production line, as you make more and more of the particular item, that causes the cost to go down. So what you see is early on, the learning rate is very rapid as research and innovation helps reduce the cost, and then it gradually plateaus out until the technology is mature. And then along comes a new technology which might compete with the old technology, and where these learning rates cross is the opportunity for the new technology to then take over from the old technology. And at that point, you will see replacement of the old technology by the new technology. So that's what learning rates are all about. And indeed, let's now have a look at learning rates for renewable energy. First of all, let's look at solar PV. And per watt of electricity produced from a particular solar panel. And you can see this is on a logarithmic scale, so going up by a factor of 10 in cost with each step. And again, on a logarithmic scale is the number of solar panels produced over time in terms of megawatts of capacity shipped. So what we see is that this learning rate for solar PV is really dramatic, and it follows pretty much a straight line for the last 50 years or so. And what this means is that the cost of solar energy has decreased enormously during this time. It's decreased by a factor of 500 in the price per watt for the module. And it's almost hard to imagine any other product, whether it be an aeroplane or a television set or a coal-fired power station, that has a price reduction over time, anything like this. The only thing comparable that I can think of is a computer chip. And again, that's made from silicon. So what we find is that essentially every time you double the number of solar panels produced, the price goes down by 23.5%. And that is equivalent to a compound annual growth rate of 33% a year. So that is an enormous learning rate. And this means that solar is decreasing in price so rapidly it's outcompeting just about everything else. Here's a similar learning rate for wind. It's not a dollar learning rate this time. It's a how many watts capacity per turbine you can generate, going back from 1990 to the present. And as you can see, the learning rate here means that we've got 100 times the capacity now that we used to in 1990 in terms of the amount of power produced from a given turbine. If we then look at how all these different technologies compete together, here's a graph which shows the learning rate. So here's cost on the vertical axis, number of megawatts, cumulative production or megawatt hours for batteries on the horizontal axis. And you can see that solar, which is the blue dots here, has the steepest, the fastest learning rate. Onshore wind is also very fast. Then we have batteries down here, the little triangles, and then various components involved in the hydrogen fuel cell process. And you can see all these learning rates are decreasing rapidly, and it's the most rapid ones that eventually will win the race. And of course, there are different capabilities that we're showing here, but by and large, these are competing with mature fossil fuel technologies for which the learning rate is completely flat. There is no change because they're mature technologies. Okay, so that's what eventually will happen. These renewable energy systems will outcompete the fossil fuel systems based on economic cost. How do we actually quantify this? Well, we use a formula called the levelized cost of electricity. Many of you will be familiar with this term. It essentially says on the top of the equation, we take all the costs involved in generating the electricity we're talking about, whether it's a solar panel or a coal-fired power station, and then we divide by the amount of energy in electricity that is produced. Okay, that's the E. And the cost involves the investment in the plant, the maintenance and operations cost, M, and the fuel expenditure, F. And we discount this using a discount rate R, which effectively says that it's a bit like an interest rate, that we value something in the present more than we value something in the future, where the future years are included in the exponent T. We do exactly the same thing with the amount of energy produced, so we divide the cost by the energy, and that's the levelized cost of electricity. But a word of caution, this assumes that we have plug and play. In other words, let's say we decommission a coal-fired power station and replace it with a wind farm in the same place. Now, of course, there may not be much wind in that location, so we need to move the wind farm somewhere else where there's more wind, and this would mean extra transmission costs, et cetera, et cetera. So just be aware that it assumes plug and play, but nonetheless, this is quite a useful comparison. And then finally, just to point out, where does the learning rate come in? It's in this term here, the investment cost. If the investment cost decreases every year, as it does with solar panels, for example, then the cost, the LCOE, will decrease as well. This is where the competition element comes in. By the way, can I ask everyone to go on mute? I can hear somebody who's not on mute, so can you all please mute your microphones? Thank you very much. Just to talk about the discount rate, which, as you see, appears in this term R. The discount rate or the interest rate varies from country to country. It's the cost of capital, effectively. And for energy, this has been mapped out by the International Energy Agency. And as you can see, there are huge differences, a factor of 7 in the cost of capital in different countries. So this means that you have to be very careful when working out your levelized cost of electricity. It depends on the particular location and your access to capital and the interest rates. So let's now look at how the levelized cost of electricity of these various technologies compare. And we'll use an Australian example because this is very important to understand, because as I said at the beginning, Australia has the highest rate of installation of renewable energy per capita in the world. So we're going through the energy transition more rapidly than anyone else. And this is driven by the learning rates for solar and wind. So let's understand that in terms of LCOE. So here on this side of the graph, we have the LCOE for various fossil fuels. So there's gas, brown coal, black coal, etc. Both without a carbon price and with a carbon price, and various risk premiums associated with that. So as you can see, it depends on how you price carbon. But you can also assume, for example, that the carbon is captured and stored. That's carbon capture and storage, or CCS, which also adds to the cost of fossil fuel power stations. If we then compare that with the levelized cost of electricity for wind and solar in Australia, what we find is that wind and solar have already become the cheapest form of new build electricity generation. So remember, this is all for building new fossil fuel power stations compared to new solar and wind farms. Even if we need to add in storage, whether it's battery storage or it's pumped hydro energy storage, the cost of electricity goes up somewhat, but not so much as to make it uncompetitive with carbon capture and storage and significant prices on carbon. And indeed, already in the Australian Capital Territory, where we are in Canberra at the Australian National University, they have been purchasing through reverse auctions wind power recently, and this has come in below $50 a megawatt hour. So that's the line here. And indeed, if you put this in terms of current dollars, because that's a fixed price for 14 years, it comes out to about $35 to $37 a megawatt hour. So already solar and wind have won the race in Australia. No one in Australia is going to build a new coal or gas-fired power station on an economic basis. So no company will do that. It'll only happen if government taxpayers' money is used to subsidise new fossil fuel power stations. So now is a good time to have a little break again and maybe do some question and answer. Again, use the raise hand facility to ask a question, or maybe use the chat and then lower your hand to remove it, and I'll stop sharing. Okay, so I've got questions in the chat. So there's a question from BMO about does implementing an electricity market system similar to NEM and WEM help the transition to low carbon power generation? Yes, it does. And we will have a special session on exactly that. So in other words, designing a market that allows all these different technologies to compete and to fill a need to deliver electricity at a particular time and at a particular level. So market design is incredibly important. We'll address that down the track. Is the short lifetime, this is from Marika, is the short lifetime of energy storage considered in the LCOE? So yes, it is. For example, batteries probably have a lifetime less than 10 years. So you need to include that in calculating the LCOE of renewables plus battery storage. And that's what is done in that study I showed, which is generated by the Australian Energy Market Operator and the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. For pumped hydro storage, the lifetime is much longer. These are dams at the top of a hill and the dam at the bottom of the hill with a pipe between them. You pump uphill when you've got plenty of renewable energy and then let water flow downhill through a generator at times when you don't have enough, and you then generate electricity. And this is about the same efficiency as a battery, about 80% efficient. So the advantage of pumped hydro storage is you don't need a river. and you can store huge amounts of energy this way, whereas batteries can only store limited amounts of energy, but they can release it very quickly, which is excellent for frequency and voltage control. So yes, those are considered. A question on carbon capture and storage, and again, we'll discuss this more later in the course. How effective is carbon capture and storage in Australia for the total carbon reduction compared to its cost? At the moment, there are a number of different studies looking at the cost of carbon capture and storage. They come in at around 80 to 100 Australian dollars a kilo, or even higher in some, a tonne, 80 to 100 Australian dollars a tonne in some cases. And if you add that to the LCOE, that prices the LCOE way off the scale. A new coal-fired power station, for example, costs about $75 a megawatt hour LCOE. Add another 80 to 100 of that, and it's uncompetitive. So CCS in Australia is not a competitive for renewable energy. And then what are my views on converting coal plants to LNG as part of the energy transition? I'll address that in a few minutes. And can we include externalities costs into the LCOE? Absolutely we can. That's from Damar. We do it for fossil fuels through a carbon price. Carbon pricing is the best way to include externalities. Every economist agrees on that, even if not all governments do. If we had a carbon price on the generation of electricity, it would become absolutely economic to invest in renewables right now. It's already economic even if you don't do that, but it would become absolutely the case if that were part of the externality process in LCOEs. Thank you for your questions in the chat. I might have missed a few, but hopefully we can address them as we go on and save them for the end, maybe. So let's now share screen again and go on to the next item. So, which is policy. So I mentioned before, there are two elements to the energy transition. There's technology that we've just talked about, and then there's policy. So just to give you a little example of how important policy can be, let me show you the following graph. So in Australia, over time, from let's say 2008 up until 2016, the amount of electricity being consumed, in other words, demand for electricity in Australia, follows this black line, okay? And this decreases over that time, which is surprising, right? Because the population has grown and the economy has grown, so you would expect more electricity to be needed. But no, a number of things happen. So first of all, the type of economy that Australia has shifted more towards the services sector and away from the manufacturing sector. So away from industries that use a lot of electricity. So that's one element, but it's not the whole story. Another element is that the price of electricity has increased over this time, factor of 2 or so, which means that people are more careful about using electricity. So they turn the lights off and they save electricity in various ways. Thirdly, technology has advanced enormously during this time. So there is much more efficient technology for industry and consumers to use. So there is less energy needed in the system. And then finally, technology has driven the rise of rooftop solar. So people have put solar on their roofs and they don't need electricity from the grid. If you allow for the fact that we've got behind the meter generation of solar electricity, then the line shifts up to the red line here. So that's the difference being the amount of solar people are putting on their roofs. And this is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as the cost of electricity goes up, but also as the price of putting solar on your roof goes down. So at the moment, it is economic in just about every state in Australia to put solar on your roof if you have a 4-year payback period. So let's see what happened here at this point to our emissions, which of course are going down because electricity generation is going down, but also we're introducing more solar, we're introducing more wind, you can see in the bottom graph. And so the amount of emissions is going down. But at this point here, suddenly in Australia, the emissions went up again in July 2014. And why was this? Well, in June 2012, Australia introduced a price on carbon. And in July 2014, it removed the price on carbon. So the emissions from the electricity sector immediately went up. And you might argue, well, this is just a coincidence. But if you look at the energy generation sources down here, what you find is that brown coal, which is the most carbon intensive form of generation, was suddenly decreased when the carbon price came on at this point. And then when the carbon price was removed in Australia, it suddenly increased. And this was then later followed, when it plateaued out, by an increase in black coal production. So this is why emissions have gone up at this point in time, because of the removal of the carbon tax. Okay, so that's a direct effect of policy. Okay, and changing policy, having no carbon tax till now, then having a carbon price, and then having no carbon price, meant that there's been huge policy changes in a short space of time. And this is not good. It makes it uncertain for industry to invest. Okay, so in 2017, the chief scientist, Dr. Alan Finkel, was asked to review the national electricity market. And following this period of policy uncertainty, he argued in this review document, which was published in 2017, that consistent long-term measures are needed to address climate change and to provide industry certainty so they can invest. Okay, so this he argued in this review. And of course, already there had been issues with the carbon price, which had been introduced before this review. And it had been ruled out by the then government, which is a coalition government, a conservative government. The party room of the coalition government ruled out carbon pricing, and it was removed in July 2014. So that was no longer an option for the future electricity market. So the chief scientist proposed a new idea, which was to have only an emissions intensity scheme for the electricity sector. This was soon again ruled out by the government. Then he proposed a new clean energy target for the electricity sector. Again, this was ruled out as a policy option. And then finally he proposed something called the National Energy Guarantee, which meant that you had to guarantee at some point in time a certain amount of energy produced by renewables. And this again was ruled out by the coalition government. So all of this produced, again, more uncertainty in the policy settings. And so for a very long time in Australia, there has been very low investment in new energy systems. Investment in the energy system essentially was stalled during this period up until 2017 or so. And so that's why it is important to note that policy certainty matters enormously. Why is this? The main reason is it de-risks investment planning. If you know that there is going to be a government policy in place for a long period of time, when a company goes to the banks to invest in a new solar farm or a new energy generator of any description, there will be a lower interest rate charged because of the fact that the investment is de-risked because the future is certain. And by lowering the cost of finance, this makes the energy transition cheaper. We know that we're going to have a transition from fossil fuels to renewables anyway. We may as well do it at the lowest possible cost. So we may as well do it with government policy certainty that decreases the cost and keeps electricity prices down. So that's why policy certainty is incredibly important. Just to show you what happened with the investment in Australia, here's a diagram from the Clean Energy Regulator, which shows the investment in renewable energy capacity in gigawatts for various types of renewables. So there's rooftop solar, that's solar on homes and businesses in yellow, utility scale solar in orange, wind power in brown, and then other fuel sources in light brown. This is the period 2016 to 2020. I'm not showing any data from the period before 2016 because the policy situation then was so uncertain. There was no investment, pardon me, there was no investment taking place. So really what happened then in 2016 and beyond? Effectively what happened was the sheer economics of renewable energy became so overpowering that even in a policy uncertain environment, it was more economic to invest in renewables than it was in anything else. And so this explains the growth in renewable investment in Australia over this time. In fact, the growth in this investment can be directly related to the learning rates, because the learning rates for solar and wind were so strong that the price came down so quickly that it was economic, even with high interest rates because of the policy uncertainty, to invest in new solar farms and wind farms. And if we break this down, then what we see is that in 2020, the renewable energy installation rate at utility scale was around 4 gigawatts per annum. Just remembering that a gigawatt is about the output of a coal-fired power station or another thermal power station at peak. And sure, we're talking peak powers here. So if you want to talk solar, you've got to divide by a factor of 4, let's say, and wind by a factor of 2. But nonetheless, this is the equivalent of replacing 4 coal-fired power stations at peak power, or let's say 1 or so at average power. And then in terms of the rooftop solar, which is driven by domestic households and small and large businesses putting solar on their roofs, this was an enormous 3 gigawatts per annum. And if you add these two together, that's a total of 7 gigawatts per annum. Even accounting for the intermittency of solar and wind, that's the equivalent of replacing 2 thermal power stations each and every year by the large and small scale solar and wind. So this is an enormous transition rate. 2 power stations a year is a very rapid change indeed. And how does this pan out? Well, we'll see in a minute. But first of all, I've got a question for you in the audience. And maybe we'll stop sharing and we'll just look at the screen for a moment. Everyone can see everybody else. So I'm going to do a quick poll of everybody. And you can use your virtual hand or your physical hand. So put your hand up if you have put solar on your own roof at home. Everybody put their hand up if you put solar on your roof at home. Let's see, we've got a few hands going up, a few physical hands, there's a few virtual hands. Yes, okay, but only a small fraction at the moment. So this is interesting. In Australia, currently, in any city in the country, if you are owning your own home, in other words, you don't rent or you're not in an apartment, but if you own your own house, it's absolutely worth your while putting solar on your roof, because the payback period is about 4 years or even 3 years if you happen to work from home. So that makes it very economic. This is changing because the cost of solar panels is decreasing. So it's going to be an even shorter payback period in years to come. And in your country, it will probably, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, it will probably reach that sort of level in years to come as well. So it's worth keeping your eye on the cost of solar because this is rapidly decreasing in many countries. Okay, I'll share screen again. Right, so let's now look at what happens then if we've got installation rates of this magnitude. Here's a very simple model. It doesn't predict the future, it's just a model that says effectively that in Australia, electricity demand remains the same as it does at the present. We've seen in the previous graph it's gone down slightly, but let's just say it stays the same. And let's assume that renewable energy, solar and wind, continues to be installed at the same rate as it was in the previous diagram. That's the green line. And of course, this means that fossil fuels have to retire at an equivalent rate. What we see then is that by around 2024 or so, fossil fuels will have declined to the point where they're less than half the electricity system. And this is only a few years away. We're in 2022 now, this is only a few years away. And of course, this may not happen because, demand may change. And indeed, we might expect that demand will go up. And why is that? Okay, let's think about why demand is going to increase. Well, first of all, we know that we're going to use renewable energy to replace the electricity sector. So that's a third of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions right here. And indeed, this is the easiest way to meet our Paris target of 28% emissions reduction. By simply converting the electricity sector to renewable energy, we can achieve that by 2030. But if we electrify all the other sources of emissions in Australia, we can do that, for example, for stationary energy generation. This is space heating and things like that. We can replace, let's say, gas heaters with heat pumps driven by renewable electricity, and we can get rid of 19% of our emissions that way. Or we can convert internal combustion engines in the transport sector to electric vehicles using renewable energy and get rid of, again, 19% of our emissions. And we can do the same thing if we no longer need fossil fuels. We get rid of fugitive emissions from mining coal and gas, and then replacing industrial processes like cement making, iron and steel, with new processes that use only electricity and hydrogen, for example, in the case of steel. So if we do all that using renewable energy to electrify all the other sectors, then we'll probably need, let's say, 2 to 3 times the amount of electricity as we do now. And this, of course, means demand for electricity will increase, right? So let's go back to our little toy model and see how this might work out. So here's just another potential scenario. So instead of demand staying constant, demand goes up because we're going to electrify the rest of the economy. That's the way that the energy transition is going to work. We electrify everything else and use renewable electricity. Okay, let's assume that, the current rate of renewables goes up to a point around here and then maybe has to increase to meet this new demand, the extra demand we've created by electrification. Then we still find that the transition point of fossil fuels to renewables happens in around the middle part of this decade. So that doesn't change very much, might shift out to 2025, 2026. But by and large, renewables will increase in order to meet this increase in demand because it's much cheaper to build a solar farm or a wind farm than it is a coal or gas-fired power station. So that's where all the extra capacity will come from. It'll come from solar and wind plus storage. Okay, so what is happening as we speak? Well, here's the very latest figures from the National Electricity Market in Australia. You can see from July 19 onwards, there's seasonal variations as can be seen here. And then we simply do a linear projection out into the next year or two. What we see is that already coal is being replaced by renewables, okay? And that gas in particular is not playing a significant role. Somebody asked a question about whether coal is being replaced by gas in Australia. That's not true. In America, it was true. Coal was replaced by gas because gas became very cheap and had huge quantities. So they undertook an intermediary transition to gas. In Australia, we're going straight from coal to renewables, and gas won't play a role in the transition as a fuel. It'll play a role in Australia in a different way. So renewables are already more than 30%. Gas is around 5% and decreasing. Gas will play a role as a peaking fuel. In other words, to provide electricity at times when solar and wind aren't operating, for example, at the evening peak. So gas will continue to play that role. We probably don't need much in the way of new gas installations to do this. So gas will have a role as a peaking fuel to smooth the transition to renewables. It won't be a transition fuel itself. Okay, so that answers the question that was in the chat previously. Some people are interested in hydrogen, whether hydrogen will replace gas. And I answer this question in terms of Australia, but it will depend upon the individual economy that we talk about. So, for example, gas is used in many countries, including Australia, to generate electricity. Will hydrogen replace gas in the electricity system? In Australia, I don't think it will. And that is because renewable energy is so cheap in Australia that it outcompetes gas. However, in other countries where there is a winter peak in demand, for example, in the Northern Hemisphere, North Asia, Northern Europe, North America, they have a peak in demand in the winter, and they often don't have much renewable generation at that time of year. So they need a seasonal fuel source, which could be hydrogen generated in the summer, stored and used for winter generation of electricity. So that might be important in some countries, but not others. And in particular in Australia, I don't believe it will be important. For low temperature heating, gas is used. Could you use hydrogen for that? Unlikely. Again, it's cheaper to electrify and use a heat pump powered by renewable energy than it is to use gas. High temperature processes, potentially it could be used for industry, for high temperature processes, but then we've also got the opportunity to use solar thermal to generate high temperatures. So again, it's not clear whether hydrogen will be a gas replacement or whether solar thermal will be a gas replacement. For industrial feedstocks, yes, I think partly. So for example, production of ammonia, renewable hydrogen will replace hydrogen from natural gas. So yes, in industrial processes, again, I think there's a role. I think there's an even more important role, though, for long-range transport, where fuel cell electric trucks and long-distance transport will see a role, where batteries, for example, aren't that practical for travelling hundreds and if not thousands of kilometres across the vast Australian distances. So that's just my personal thoughts on the role of hydrogen in Australia. Other countries will be quite different, as I said, but in Australia, I think the big role for hydrogen will be in exports. As I said right at the very beginning of this discussion, it will dominate domestic hydrogen consumption because the export opportunities are so big. So how high can renewable penetration go? Well, once you get more than 50% renewables, as we've been discussing, when renewables take over from fossil fuels, you need to be able to cover the intermittent nature of solar and wind because, cloud formations cover solar farms, the wind sometimes doesn't blow at wind farms. You need to address the intermittent nature of renewables. And you have three options for doing that. The first is to overbuild supply, and indeed to have your supply in different locations. So that's the advantage in Australia. We have huge geographic spread of our national grid. It covers 5,000 kilometres. So somewhere it will be windy, for example. So you overbuild supply is one option. The second is to build additional storage capability. So again, this is mainly through pumped hydro, which can store enormous amounts of energy. And you might have heard of the project called Snowy 2.0. This is the big Snowy hydroelectric scheme being expanded to store electricity by pumping water uphill in the Snowy Mountain scheme in Australia. Or you could build batteries around the country to do at least local small-scale storage. And then finally, you need to build additional network infrastructure because you need to access renewable electricity wherever it is most effectively generated. And this is often not where the demand centres are in the cities. It's often in the countryside or in windy regions at the coast or on the hills. So you need to build additional network infrastructure. And this adds to cost. And we've calculated the cost here at the ANU, and other people have done the same thing, the energy market operator and others. And it adds about 50% to the cost of a 100% renewable electricity system. But again, going back to the LCOE discussion, this is still cheaper than building a new coal or gas-fired power station. And it's certainly cheaper if you include a carbon price or carbon capture and storage in the LCOE for fossil fuels. The next question is, will this provide the same level of reliability of supply? And I would argue that yes, it can, and perhaps even better, and we'll come to that in a minute. But it's all around the fact that you've got this distributed system with multiple redundancy. Will it provide the same level of security, for example, during increasing extreme weather events or cyber attacks? Well, that's a very good question as well. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Maybe is the answer. We can have that discussion. Let me just point to one example of reliability. which I think indicates that this is completely doable. So Germany has an increasing amount of renewables in its system. That's the green line here, going up in 2006 from 12% to over 30% in more recent times. And during that time, the number of blackouts on the grid, the amount of hours of blackouts on the grid, didn't increase as the amount of renewables went up. It actually decreased. And this is through clever engineering, proper software control systems, good management, good governance. And so it's absolutely the case that even with intermittent solar and wind, the system does not need to have more blackouts, and indeed could be made more reliable just because of the diversity in the system. Okay, so we might pause that, and I've got a question that I've put in the Moodle that I'd like to hear an answer from each country. So maybe one person from Vietnam, one person from the Philippines, one person from Indonesia could maybe give me the answer to this. And we've been talking about what is the renewable fraction in your country. And in Australia at the moment, it's 31.4% of the national electricity market in 2021. That was last year. So maybe if we just stop sharing the screen at the moment, someone from each of your three countries can tell me what your fraction of renewables is currently, and we can do a comparison. So stop share. And I see that we have somebody from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources in Indonesia. Is that Olia? Would you like to tell us what the percentage is in Indonesia at the moment?
Yes, Professor Ken Baldwin. My name is Aulia from Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. As for electricity market in Indonesia, currently the renewable portion is about 11.7% in the end 2021, and mostly our supply from hydro power plant, and secondly from geothermal.
Yeah. Somebody from the Philippines or Vietnam who can tell us what the percentage is there? Anybody? If not, maybe somebody can look it up during the next few minutes and put it in the chat, and we can compare it at the end. I suspect that Vietnam is changing very rapidly because of your massive feed-in tariff changes recently. So you've got a lot of installations happening in the last few years that are just about to come online and contribute.
Zil Michael, would you like to join in and explain a little bit more about the rate of electricity in Vietnam, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dr. Thang and Professor Ken. So basically, for now, the renewable energy, which is the solar and wind, and of course rooftop solar, we have 27% of total installed capacity, in compared to 78 gigawatt of the system. So accounting for 10% of produced energy. So it only includes the solar and wind and biomass. But when you add the hydropower, with large scale and small scale, it can up to 40%. So basically, we count only solar and wind and biomass as renewable energy. So thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so that's quite significant. Yes, and I thought that might be the case given the huge investment recently with the feed-in tariffs. Okay, that's interesting. So I've seen a number of people contributing in the chat. If somebody from the Philippines can let us know in the chat. Here we go. So Isabella says that renewable energy is about 30%, but somebody from DOE might have a more accurate figure. All right. So very interesting, and interesting to know the different mixes in the different countries between hydro, geothermal, solar, wind, etc. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back. I'll share my screen again and we'll just finish off the rest of the presentation. Now I want to talk a little bit about energy and security, because this is a key issue in the transition. How are we going to make a secure form of energy supply into the future? And let me show you another example from Australia of how we look at this. So this is the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO. They do a study of the resilience of the National Electricity Market, or the NEM. And they've done this for different years, 2018-19 in the left, 2028-29 in the middle, and 2038-39 on the right. And this model simply assumes that we transition from fossil fuels to renewables during this time, and we don't do much else. We just change the power source. And then look at how reliable the system is going to be if we have those assumptions. Remembering that we've got the world's longest interconnected system in the world, over 5,000 kilometers, and it's very long and very thin, okay? So it just goes around the coast. And what they find is that the green is strong resilience, red is poor resilience. So the system is getting weaker going into the future. In other words, there's more red around the place. And so what they've done is that they've taken this and they've come up with what they call an integrated system plan, where they now not only propose renewable energy zones, often inland for solar farms or on the top of mountains for wind farms, where they will need the renewable energy to be produced in the best places. And then they predict where the transmission lines need to be built in order to access those, and where the storage in the way of pumped hydro or batteries needs to be placed in order to provide firm supply at the time it's needed. So this is all about central planning. This is a very important shift in thinking, that we now need to have central planning in order to plan the energy transition to make it work for us. So this goes away from a free market approach, which has prevailed in the past. So now we have central integrated system planning. So this is renewable energy zones, as I said, connection using high voltage direct current transmission lines between major demand centers and the generators, and then the backing up using storage, and also frequency and voltage control, particularly from batteries, which provide excellent capability in that area. So what will this look like in the future? This will look much more like the Internet of Energy. In other words, there will be millions of generators, there'll be millions of storage centers. People will have batteries in their homes, they'll have batteries in their cars, there'll be batteries in the neighborhood, batteries in the city. There'll be pumped hydro up and down the country, and there'll be demand response with millions of participants. Each household will be able to turn off its air conditioning if it's paid money to do so at peak demand times. Or a major industrial user will turn off their, I don't know, freezer for an hour in order to save money and be given a bonus for their demand response. Then the scale of this will vary enormously as well. So from kilowatts in rooftop solar to gigawatts in major solar and wind farms, kilowatt hours to terawatt hours in terms of the amount of storage, whether it's household batteries or major hydro schemes, pumped hydro. And also, very much like the internet, the future electricity system will have much greater interconnectivity between these millions of different nodes. So it will resemble, if you like, the Internet of Energy in all these ways. What does this mean for the robustness or the resilience of the system? So this is all, you know, the thinking around resilience and planning. Well, I think the good news is that there will be more robustness because you've got greater multiplicity of nodes. There's greater redundancy. There's a greater multiplicity of transmission pathways. Again, greater redundancy in how you move the electricity around. And the system will no longer be vulnerable to the removal of a single major thermal power station, which is a big risk. Recently in Queensland, there was a fire in a major 2 gigawatt thermal power station that immediately took it offline. and there were huge blackouts resulting from this. If you have a distributed Internet of Energy type system with lots of different generators spread all over the place, you're much less likely to get one big catastrophic event happening. So this will again provide robustness. However, there's more likely to be vulnerability from cyber attacks because every entry point that you add to the system becomes an attack point. So for example, the fridge in your house, which is being turned on and off by your home computer because the electricity provider is asking you to do demand response to reduce your usage and pay you money at peak times. Your fridge could be the entry point for a hacker to get in and take down the electricity system. And if you think this is a bit fanciful, we all know what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. It's not only under military attack, it's under cyber attack. But a number of years ago, its entire electricity system was taken down by a foreign agent who hacked into the electricity control systems and essentially prevented it from operating. So this has already happened in other countries around the world. So there's potential for more vulnerability because in an Internet of Energy system, there's more attack points. But I would also argue that it's probably more resilient because if you had an attack point in a major thermal power station and took the thermal power station out, that would have a more dramatic effect than maybe removing a small solar farm or a small battery storage facility. So let's look at this entire question of energy security from the perspective of energy sources within countries, indigenous energy sources. And what we see is that there will be a trend to national self-sufficiency. Every country will have solar and wind to contribute. There will be domestic gas in some countries, coal seam gas, shale gas, tight gas. There will be domestic liquid fuels, again, from unconventional production of shale oil, biofuel, synthetic fuels. And through the electrification of things like transport and domestic systems and industry, the ability to rely on these domestic sources will improve. And in countries which embrace nuclear power, because of the small volume of uranium needed to fuel the power stations, this is less of a security risk. And indeed, in the future generation of nuclear power stations, which use fast neutron reactors, you can reuse the spent fuel from old nuclear power stations. So you don't need to import uranium at all. So all these trends to national self-sufficiency through energy sources operating within countries will improve energy security. So the good news is that these new energy capabilities will improve our energy security. There'll be fewer energy resource wars as a result in the long term. Nobody is going to go to war over somebody else's solar or wind. There'll be less opportunity to interdict supply chains. So the sailing of oil and gas ships through the Straits of Hormuz will be a thing of the past for people to worry about. There might be some domestic energy security issues in order to balance the electricity supply, but we've already seen that you can do this via the Internet of Energy by having greater connectivity, more storage and multiple redundancy. In countries which have nuclear power, there's the risk of potential nuclear proliferation. But again, through good governance and good management systems, this risk can be ameliorated. There will be cybersecurity risks by interdicting disseminated energy systems with more entry points. But as I pointed out, it's perhaps just as robust to have an Internet of Energy as it is to have a centralized system with large thermal generators being at risk of cyber interdiction. And finally, just the general resilience of the Internet of Energy in our planning going forward, as we've seen in Germany and other places, will make the future energy system more robust, so energy security will improve. Okay, so we're near the end. We have the time now for a few quick questions before summing up. So happy to have a chat about what are some of the key energy security issues in your country. So again, please raise your virtual hand and we can have a bit of a discussion about energy security. So I'll stop sharing so we can have a bit of a discussion now. If people would like to share some of their concerns with energy security in their country.
Thanks, Professor Campbell-Wynne. A very interesting and informative session. Now is the Q&A time, so we would like to invite you to join and speak up in the discussion. Some of you have put the questions in the chat box, but this is the time for you to speak and join the discussion, please.
I see there's a question from Ahmad Mudani. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. I'm Ahmad Murdani from PTPLN Indonesia. So according to the discussion today, like you said before about the energy security itself, in Indonesia, especially in Jawa Bali Power System, we experienced like about almost 2 years ago, what we call like crisis of the coal itself. Yeah, we are on our way to net zero carbon emissions to 2060, but currently we still rely on the what we call coal power plants, because almost 70% of energy mix in Indonesia, especially in Jawa Bali Power Systems, supplied by the coal power plant. So at that time, we are experiencing the coal supply crisis, since the what we call global price of the coal itself spikes very high, or more than 100 USD, while in our domestic price, it's kept by policy that the maximum price of domestic market obligation is only 70 USD. At that time, that the supplier it's tend to export the coal itself rather than to fulfill the domestic needs at that time. So I think it's what they call it makes sense, yeah, for the business player. But what I'm going to ask about the Australia, I'm seeing that Australia and Indonesia has the same what they call electricity background, and because Australia formerly most of the energy mix are supplied by the coal power plant, especially like nights and also coal itself. How do you what happened if there is what we call a global spike of the coal price itself, and most of the supplier of the coal itself in your country don't want to fulfill the domestic at the time? Because I know that the commodity of coal itself, market mechanism of coal itself is very liberal in Australia. So how do you secure your coal itself when the coal price is very high at that time? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it relates not just to coal but also to gas. So yeah. So actually in Australia, what we found is because of the way the bidding system works in the national electricity market, it's the last marginal bidder, the highest marginal bidder, that sets the price. And usually this is the gas generators. And with the price of gas going up recently, this has caused an increase in electricity prices. And so gas supply has the same issue with price. And so again, as the system transitions away from depending on the market price of fuel for fossil fuels and more towards indigenous in-country generation of renewables, the less subject you are to these international fluctuations. And so what I think will happen is that because the supply chains will be much more within the control of each country, that you'll experience less of this price spiking activity.
Okay, I think one more thing, the last one. So I sometimes see the IMO and NEM itself about the moving of the electricity spot market price at that time. So when I see that there is a spike of the price at that time, I'm thinking that there is, yeah, it's usual because of the supply and demand itself. So when the supply of the generation at that time is very rare, and then the price goes up, And then at that time, what is any, what do you call, market securities that implies to your system to secure that the price is not overly, I mean, goes very high like that. So it's in the state of very still affordable for the, what do you call, the electricity buyer like that.
Yeah, that's true. But once again, I think, you know, in the transition, moving to a system that allows zero marginal cost bidders like solar and wind will mean that they will dominate the market system. And that's why market design is very important, because you then need to accommodate the fact that that they will be able to bid in the market at very low prices. So maybe we'll move on to another question now. I see that
Thank you.
That PH Malia Letrero has a question.
Hello, yes, good noon. Actually, this is not a question really, sir. It's, can I be heard?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Nice. I was just looking at your security, so I'm not really so sure about the cybersecurity at this point here. But in terms of my region in the Philippines is situated at the end of the grid. And so we are very vulnerable in a lot of ways, especially with the transmission lines. So now we are facing actually congested in transmission lines because there was an incident that happened where the submarine cable was destroyed in Amlan. And so now they have to do something to source out the, you know, the lines to be okay for us, because even in Negros where they're experiencing already like a 12-hour brownout, 8 to 12 out. So that is the vulnerable the security that we are facing whenever there are disasters.
Yes, and the same thing happens, I think, for anywhere which is, you know, has a long undersea cable connection. It happened in Tasmania recently. So again, part of the solution for this goes back to the Internet of Energy. Having microgrid capability with lots of disseminated sources of energy, wind, solar, storage, is going to be really important into the future. And Australia experienced this in the bushfires. So a lot of rural communities were cut off in the bushfires because the fires burnt the power lines, and they had no power for weeks. And so moving to microgrids with local generation makes enormous sense for these remote areas. And indeed, the power companies don't want to keep servicing the power lines, so they want microgrids to happen as well. So I think that's part of the future energy mix in many ways. Other questions? People that want to put their hand up, I can see there's some in the chat. Xuan says, are there any policy incentives to install solar PV in residential areas in cities? In Vietnam, infrastructure and building structures make it hard to put rooftop because of the small space in urban areas. Well, that's a problem in many big cities, particularly in apartments where, you know, you don't have much roof space and there are lots of people, so you don't get to share in the energy. Yes, so there have in the past been lots of incentives in Australia. There have been feed-in tariff incentives, there have been installation incentives, but by and large, those have been diminished. There is still the renewable energy target, which has now been met. So that provided an incentive in Australia, but now by and large, no incentives are needed. People are just putting rooftop solar on because it makes enormous economic sense to do so without an incentive. For example, to put a 7,000 watt, 7 kilowatt system on your roof now costs about $3,500 if you get a really cheap discount from your supplier. That's 50 cents per watt. That was unheard of. I put solar on my roof, I don't know, 7 years ago, and it cost me $2.50 a watt. So it's 5 times cheaper now. So this change is happening very rapidly. So incentives are no longer needed. The price is so cheap anyway. Any other questions that we can? I've dealt with a question about what role does gas play, asked by Hong Nguyen. Ahmad.
Thank you, Ken. I think that we have time for one more question. So please address that one as the last for this session. Of course, we will have time for discussion in the discussion forum later. Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. So let me address the question from Ahmad Custriantono, who says, looking into Europe, Australia, Japan, and China, the main contributor to renewable energy are wind and solar, while in Indonesia, there are only 2 wind farms that are operating. So as I mentioned in the presentation, wind and solar basically are the front runners in renewable energy generation in just about every country. Wind in Indonesia is not as good as in some countries. If you look at wind maps of Indonesia, it lies in the part of the world called the doldrums, which means that there's not much wind during large parts of the year. But there are trade winds at some times of year. There is a company that I know in Canberra who have mapped Indonesia's wind prospects. And in some places up on high ridge tops, there is still very good wind energy possibilities. So these, I guess, have yet to be exploited. But by and large, Indonesia has better solar opportunities than it does wind. And indeed, the sun belt around the equator, even though you have monsoon with cloudy periods, there's still sunlight getting through during the monsoon. So solar is probably the best prospect, but wind is not insignificant in some parts of the Indonesian archipelago, particularly in the higher ridgetop regions. Okay, so I think that's all we've got time for at the moment. I'm very happy to answer questions online by email or whatever. So please, if you've got questions on the chat that I haven't answered, send me a message and I will answer that offline. So great to talk to everyone today. Thank you for your participation. It's been very active and very good. I'm glad that people can tell us what their experience is in their own country. And I look forward to the rest of the course with everybody and contributing at different points during the rest of the course.